Hey guys, good afternoon or good evening once again, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Nana Ifwa Benyao, and I work for Cadana as a product stroke business development associate. So my colleague is Sean, who is supposed to be moderating the session today, but unfortunately, due to technical challenges, he's not able to join us right now. So I'll be stepping in for him for now. And when he joins, he will definitely take it up from there. So today's session is an interesting one. I'm pretty much excited about it. It's all about building a scalable design system as a product designer. And our guest for today is Joey Banks. So in terms of moderation wise, we are going to start with a little brief about Cadana and what we do. Then right after that, Joey will introduce himself and take it up from there. We'll do a little bit of masterclass which has to do with product design. I think Joey is well prepared for that session. And after the masterclass, we'll just zoom into Q&A. So during the Q&A session, you can feel free to leave your questions or anything that you want to say. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. You can just raise your hand and I will allow you to unmute yourself to speak. Or you can also type in your questions in the chat box, right? So that we can read it, take it up from there, read it out, and Joey will answer you. Going back to the Q&A session, I just want to let everybody know that that part is not just about technical skills, but any other questions, like let's say, ask me anything you want to know about Joey, from his professional life to his personal life, feel free to dig in and ask him all the questions that you have on your table. We are so much excited to have this and also to have you on it. Let me just quickly go ahead and introduce Cadana and what we do. So Cadana Inc., or most of you know as Cadana Pay, is a fintech company that provides infrastructure for African workers and freelancers to aid their financial management. So basically what we do is that we have an online application that primarily serves as a tool for you to access your end salary, right, across all boards. So basically we help you to facilitate your payments, international payments, and international payments. Let me just put it that way. So what we basically do is that, let's say as a freelancer or as a remote worker, most of you who signed up mentioned that you use Fiverr to get most of your gigs to work on. So basically what we do is that when you get a gig on Fiverr and you work on that gig, when you are done and the clients that you work for needs to pay you, you can basically use Cadana to facilitate that compensation payout on our side. So basically we give you access to euros, pounds, and dollar accounts, virtual bank accounts that you can use it to give it to your clients to pay you your work funds through that. And you can easily, when you receive this money in the various foreign currencies that I've mentioned about, you can easily swap it on the same platform, on our platform, Cadana mobile platform. You can easily swap it to your local currency and access it from there. Right now, I will just move straight into the session for today and pass on the mic to Joey to take it over. So Joey, over to you. Kindly introduce yourself and let us know what you do.
Cool, thanks so much. If it's okay, I'll screen share real quick and I present my, I've got a couple slides and then we'll get into Figma. It looks like screen sharing might be disabled. Are you able to adjust that in the settings panel?
Okay.
Got it.
You should be able to, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Well, hi everyone. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It really means a lot, and it's been amazing to see just the design community in Africa. Like, I feel like I'm seeing more and more designers from there. I'm meeting more and more designers through mentorship. That's one thing I wanted to mention up front. I do a lot of mentoring on ADPL. If you're on there and if you ever want to learn more or just say hello, feel free to grab a session. I would love to say hi. So thanks for having me. Thanks for spending your time today with me. Just a quick agenda for things that I was going to go through. Wanted to share a bit about myself and how I got into design systems. And then I'll take maybe 20 or so minutes just to walk through what I think are many of the best features within Figma to really help with design systems. I'll talk a lot about Figma. I hope that's okay. Really want to share all the best practices that I use every day that hopefully can help you too in your career. And then finally, of course, want to leave a majority of time for Q&A. Everything related to interviewing, portfolios, career, please feel free to unmute, ask me, or type in chat. I would be happy to share all I can about just my own experience and anything I can do to help. I'd be happy to share more on. So a bit about me. I have my wife, Kristen, here in that first photo. I've also got a little dog named Ellie. She's about 9 years old now, and she's amazing. I'm based here in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, here in the States. I've been here for pretty much all my life. I was born here, but I spent a few years out in California, and then moved my way back just to be a bit closer to family and friends. And so this is where I reside now. I've had a few companies that I've worked at so far. I'm currently over at Webflow. If anyone knows of that product, it's an amazing tool to help anyone build sites with very little or no code. But before that, I was at Twitter, I was at Figma, I was in healthcare for a little bit as well. And all of these companies and all of these experiences have taught me so much. But the one I really want to focus on today, and I think what really helped elevate my own interest in design systems, in design, and this tool that is Figma, and in helping others, is the experience I had in 2019 of when I worked for Figma. I joined the team as a designer advocate, and that role was all about just helping other designers understand the tool better, understand how to use it for their applications and the designs and projects and freelance and work life that they were doing. And so that working with that community and just learning the tool was my favorite experience. And I try to do it, I try to push that knowledge on as much as I can. I want to say too, one thing that I noticed kind of jumping from each one of these companies, right, is there's a lot of pressure just to feel like you have to know right away what it is you want to spend your time doing. Right now, I'm so clearly cut on design systems. I love this work, but 4 or 5 years ago, I had no idea that was the right path. And so if you're feeling lost at all, I would just encourage you to explore in the world of design. There's so many different areas, from research to product to prototyping to design systems. And if you are interested in design systems and want to see what that is like, again, feel free to unmute, ask me questions, or find me on ADPL later in the year. I would be happy to share more. I thought I'd share, how I got into design systems a little bit. Maybe like many of your experiences, it always starts with the color palette, right? This was our company's color palette at the time, but it ended up looking a lot like this, where it was very hard to understand the design system that we had because we didn't have one. And it was also quite tough to just keep all of these colors in order, right? And so we also had so many buttons like this, no joke, this is very close to the amount of buttons that we were seeing within the product. And so we knew that a design system could help. This kind of led me to understanding the world of components and Figma and design systems a bit more, and I started sharing more. If you follow me on the Figma community, you might notice that I do these really large, in-depth iOS focus kits, and the goal of that was really just to share kind of what I knew about iOS and to help others start designs faster. And so I wanted to share this because if you're ever interested in like, how do I exactly structure my files, or how do I work with components, this file could hopefully be a great resource, because everything I do in here is kind of what I do in real life. And so I just wanted to share that. And I'd encourage anyone who is interested in design systems to just kind of think about, like, if something is helpful for you, right? Maybe it could be helpful for others too, whether that's sharing something, whether that's being the design system person in the company who is creating these components to help others use them and to help others build them. Or if you're just designing for yourself, right? Maybe you are part of a smaller team, or you're doing some side projects. Just this idea of systems and scalability and creating things that are helpful to you will help you down the road, I guarantee. And so this is really where I personally fell in love with design systems. And a couple last notes here is, I think this field is so interesting and awesome, not just design systems, but the area of design, is because you can help people do their best work through the work that you create. It's why I'm excited to chat with all of you today and hopefully share a little bit more about Figma, about design systems. And I want to say real quick, and I saw there was a Q&A, if you are interested in seeing a little bit more about the Figma iOS file that I made, you can go to ioskit.design/16, and that'll take you directly to the Figma file. So hopefully that works. The last thing I want to say, just as we think about Figma and as we think about design systems and organization, is I would encourage everyone to think a lot about, as you set up these structures, as you think about your world in Figma, what does it look like to really scale a design system, right? And to organize files to help others in the company or on your team just find things a little bit easier. And so this is a method that I use all the time, and I just wanted to share a screenshot of it, which is thinking in this like tree structure, where at the very top of the tree, you have your design tokens. Those are your colors, maybe your typography, your shadows, your effects, everything like that. And then one level down, and I'll explain what these levels mean, but one level down, you'll have your iconography, your product illustrations. And these two files here, or these two component libraries, pull from your color tokens, right? And so thinking about, how do I move this tree upwards and how do I create these files that pull from above is really important. Something else I've started doing is just creating separate component libraries for different platforms that I'm designing for. So if this is you, I would definitely encourage you to have a library for all of your iOS components and a library for all of your Android components or your web components. This just helps the design team scale a little bit faster. When you think about bringing on a new designer, knowing that they can enable a new library that is focused on, let's say, Android, and just see all of the components that are relevant to Android is awesome. And I think that's frankly the coolest part of Figma. And then down below, as you're thinking about design systems and working as a product designer, I would think a little bit about how do you want to break these libraries into smaller libraries, right? Maybe you're working at a team that has a messaging feature, but you also have dozens of other features that are part of that product. Perhaps you create a feature file that's just focused on the components for that messaging feature. That way, you're able to enable that library, and you're only seeing components that are relevant there. And so this sort of chart or this sort of workflow has been really helpful to me, and I just wanted to pass it on where I could. So beyond that, those are all the slides I had. I just want to give a quick introduction. I thought it'd be helpful to talk about a few core Figma features that really helped me with my work in creating design systems. And I wanted to talk more about some of maybe the more intimidating sides of Figma, around auto layout, around organization, around naming, and finally component properties. And so if it's okay, I'll do a few demos and kind of walk through some of Figma's features. Again, all of this with the light of how to make a design system better, how to work easier and better in Figma to create the thing that helps more people. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to just ask in chat. I'll try to monitor that as I go, and I would love to just help out. So the first thing I always love to share with people is auto layout, right? Working in Figma, all we want to do is create these scalable, awesome little assets that scale with the text that we have, with the amount of content that we have inside, right? And so when we take a button like this, that's a component, and we duplicate it, just holding Option and dragging, and if we type some text in here, such as hello or hello everyone, our button doesn't scale, right? Of course, we want this button to resize with the content that we have inside. And so if you're not familiar, you can apply auto layout to achieve this. We could either click the entire component here, and on the right-hand side, we can hit auto layout. Or if you're using keyboard shortcuts like I am a lot, you can always just hit Shift A, and that'll immediately apply auto layout. And speaking of shortcuts, if you hit Command / or Control / on Windows, you will get a little pop-up menu here. And the reason I wanted to call this out is if you type in keyboard or the start of keyboard, you can launch keyboard shortcuts here. And this is helpful because when I was learning Figma, I felt really overwhelmed by the amount of shortcuts, the ways of working faster. And this little panel here really helps me just understand, like, what are the tools that are even available here in Figma? And if those tools are available, what are the shortcuts for them? And so as you learn Figma, as you get better at this tool, as you get faster, you'll notice a lot of the ones in blue are the shortcuts that you have used in the past. And the ones that are not highlighted in blue are shortcuts that you have yet to use. And so I think this feature is really awesome and can just be docked down here at the bottom of the page as you use Figma. So just wanted to call this out. Again, to get to it, just click the little Figma logo up here, quick actions, type in keyboard, and you'll see keyboard shortcuts right there as an option. So back to our button example. Let's walk through auto layout a little bit more, because if you're not familiar with auto layout, it can be really kind of scary to use components that have it, or if you're thinking of building with auto layout, it might not be clear where to start. And so with this button, we saw just a few moments ago, I applied auto layout. And as soon as I did that, Figma gave me this new options panel over here to the right-hand side. There's a few options in here, and many of these you'll use all the time. And so I just want to make sure everyone is completely familiar with them. So the first one is the direction. You can change the direction of the stack really easily. In this case, it probably doesn't make sense for our button to look like this. We want it to be horizontal, and so we'll adjust that there. The second control here is what I call the gap between items. And all this does, if you hold your cursor and scrub it, it changes the spacing between all of the nested items inside of the parent auto layout container. So in here, I have two items. I have an icon and some text. And as I adjust this, that spacing between those items is changing. So this is a really powerful feature. In this case, we probably want to do, let's say, like 16, or maybe even bump that down to 8. That looks a little bit better. Now down here, we have our padding controls, right? So this is where we can easily switch our left and right padding, as well as our top and bottom padding. One trick is if you wanted to say, let's do maybe 32 on the left and perhaps 24 on the right, you can do 32, 24 and hit enter. And you'll notice if I click on this icon here and I hold the Option key or the Alt key, you'll see 32. And then if I click on the text, you'll see 24. So by typing 32, 24 into that box, I was able to separate those values over here on the right-hand side. And the same thing can be done for top and bottom. Let's say I want maybe 24 for the top and bottom, and sorry, let's do maybe 24 for the top and 12 for the bottom. I can get something like this really easily. Now, this kind of looks like a terrible button, right? And so let's just do 32, 24, and that looks a little bit better with a bit more room. And so now this button functions exactly as we would expect. I also want to share, when we're working with auto layout, something that can get a little bit complicated is the idea between fill and fixed and hug sizing properties. And so what I mean by that is if we look at our button here and we look up to the right-hand side, there are two options that we'll use really often with auto layout. The one on the left is horizontal resizing. So what this means is how is your button resizing in the horizontal direction? And this one here is your vertical resizing. So how is it resizing in the vertical direction? And how I think about these controls are kind of silly, but a hug, it's just like, imagine you're hugging a balloon, let's say, and if the balloon that you're hugging gets bigger and bigger, your hug is going to get bigger and bigger, right? And so you're physically hugging something and it's reliant on that object size. So in this case, we have our horizontal resizing set to hug, right? And as I type in more text here, our button is getting larger because it's hugging that content, if that makes sense. Fixed is exactly what it sounds like. It's fixed. So regardless of how much text I type in here, our button is not going to change its size. But this also means that if I want, I can resize this manually, right? And so I can drag this, and regardless of that, I'll always see a fixed value over here, or a fixed option, I should say. And then finally, there's one more option, which is fill. And the important thing about fill is we're not seeing it here in this menu, and this trips up a lot of people. Where you'll see fill is you have to create a new container that has auto layout. And with that container now that has auto layout, you will now be able to click on your object, go up here and see that fill container, right? And as this container here, as it gets larger or smaller, your button is going to fill the container, right? It's just like pouring water into a vase. The water is going to get as large or as small as the vase is. And so that's how I try to think about these things, because bouncing back between them all the time can get a little bit confusing. All right, so I want to go into another example that has helped me a lot. This is around auto layout and layout grids. And so The example I want to share here is we all commonly work with, let's say, a tab bar. Whether you're an iOS or Android or even the web, you might have something that looks like this, right? And I've got this turned into a component. And if I duplicate this, so I have an instance now, as noted by that single diamond icon. Well, if I resize this, we can see that all of our icons here stay centered. And that's not really what we want, right? We probably prefer for our icons to stretch with the actual container. And so when we think about this, we might think a little bit about auto layout, for example. And so I've got a frame here called tabs. And if I expand this, I can see all of my tabs inside, right? And so your first thought might be, okay, well, I've got this container. It has all of these tabs. Let's just apply auto layout and see what happens. And so at first, it's not clear, right? Like, why did all of those icons go over here? And so that's something that we can work with. We can say, well, maybe in this case, instead of having each of these icons 4 pixels apart, which adjusts this, we could do something called typing in auto here. And what auto does is it takes every individual item and it pushes it as far out as it can. And so what's really cool about this is as I add more icons in here, you can see they're all distributed evenly. So I use this tip a lot. But one thing I want to call out here, and this might be new to you, is if we resize this, actually, this isn't really how a tab bar would work, right? Because if we make this smaller or if we make this larger, we would expect the size here on the left or on the right to match the size here, right? So it doesn't always make sense that for a really large tab bar, we only have that much spacing between our left or our right icon. And there's one trick that has really helped me out with this. And so what that is on the tabs frame here, I'm actually going to remove auto layout. And instead, I'm going to add what's called a layout grid here. And by default, this will create just a grid of lines, which will be red. But we want to click on this little icon here. And instead of having a grid, we want to adjust this to columns. And now it's really interesting is Figma is giving us these 5 invisible columns, which we can turn on or off, just Control G, that'll show or hide those layout grids. But let me show you this. As we go in and as we click on these icons here, and let's go back to this layout grid and let's actually make our gutter a little bit smaller. I think maybe 1 will work fine for that. Well, we can close out of this. And if we click on each of our tabs in here, we can select them and we can apply constraints. And so check this out. If I change my constraint to the left, all of our icons here go to the left. If I do the right, they all go to the right. But if I choose top and center, now check out what happens. If I resize this, we can see that the space on the left is matching the space here a little bit more like we would expect in real life. And so the whole idea here is when you apply a layout grid, all of the icons inside or any of the elements inside, if you have constraints set up, they will apply to that column or to that row that is in that layout grid. So I hope this example can help. It has helped me out in so many situations where I want to make sure that the left spacing equals the right spacing. And I thought this would be a good example to share. All right, so next up, I want to talk about design systems a little bit more. And that first revolves around organization and naming. This is something we do all the time in the world of design systems, is trying to organize and name things better for those who are using those items. And so what I wanted to share here is I actually have, this is from the iOS kit, and I have 4 different frames set up. I have one called text field, center alert, tab bar, and alerts. And what's really interesting about this approach of creating frames and then putting the components inside of those frames is if I click on the assets panel up here, and let's say I go to our page here, which was called frames and organization, I can actually see these 4 frames that are on the canvas as clickable items in the sidebar. So if I click on alerts, I'm able to see all of the components that are a part of alerts. And this might not seem like a big deal at first, but if I go back to the layer list, and if I take all of my frames here, and if I hit Command Shift G, let's do Command Shift G to ungroup them. So now all of these components are just sitting on the canvas. Check out what happens to our layer list over here in the assets panel. We can actually see that we lost that structure, right? So now all of our components are individually listed over here. And if we want to see all of the components that relate to alert, well, we have to click on this one, we have to click on this one, and we have to click on this one, right? And so just to undo that change, you can see now it's so much easier when you do have those frames to organize things in this way. So if you're working on components for yourself, if you're building a larger design system, I really hope this tip can help. And it's visually, I think, great, and structurally helps a lot too. So next, I want to talk about naming. And this is something I personally struggle a lot with in Figma. And I wanted to share kind of where I landed and how I approach naming components in the tool today. So if I have something like a segmented picker here, and if you're not familiar, all this is a component that looks like this in iOS, very similar in Android too. And what you can do is you can go in and you can say, well, which one should be selected for all of these? We have different ones, right? So here I can change the number of options to, let's say, 2. I could select the right value. I could select the left value. I could turn this into dark mode. I could add icons or remove icons, right? And so all of this is happening with the component, which is really cool. The thing, though, that we often want to do as designers working in Figma is we might want to think a little bit more about, well, how can I create a component to build the larger component, right? And so if I zoom back into here to this component, if I expand the layer list over here, you can see that we have 2 instances inside. And if I look at where this instance is actually located, it's just up here at the top, just sitting above where that segmented picker actually is. The reason I want to do that is that makes life a little easier, right? If I ever want to go in and maybe change the border radius to, instead of 7, we change it to 0. Well, I can just do that in one place, and I know that it's applied everywhere else, right? We can bring this all the way down, and now we can see that effect here. And so that's why I love creating components this way, where you start small and you build out to the larger thing. The problem, though, is if you are doing this method, it's really unhelpful usually for a designer to ever see this component here in their sidebar, right? If they're looking for components to work with and they come across a component that is this segmented picker option control here, this probably isn't too helpful in their designs, right? There's not a lot you can do with this. You might have to duplicate it and then change the value here to be selected, and then perhaps select both of these and kind of build the component again. And that's not great, and it just adds a little bit more confusion. And so one tip that I wanted to share is that with any component in Figma, what you can do is you can actually add an underscore at the start of the component's name. And what this does is this makes it a private component in Figma, which means it will not be published to any team library. So this means that it will not be accessible via the assets panel for any designer who is relying on components that you're making. And this is super powerful because what's really great about this is I can still take an instance of our component down here, our public component. So I can copy this. I can go into a new file and I can paste that component in. And of course, I can still work with it, right? But if you go into the layer list here, you'll actually see that we have 2 private components that are included in this public component. And so as a designer, I'm still able to find this public segmented picker control component. But if I were to search for these, I'm not going to find them. And that like structure in Figma has proved to me to be so valuable and useful. And so I just wanted to share that. On naming real quick, what I like to do is for any component that I'm building like this, I will start with the name for where this component is going to live. In this case, this helper component here is going to live in a component that's called segmented picker. So I'll include that name up here. I'll add a dash, and then I will add the name of what I want to call this component, right? So this case, this control here is called segmented picker dash option control. The reason for that is if I'm referencing it in a design, I can see very easily that this component here is meant for the control that's called segmented picker, right? And if you had a bunch of instances inside, they might be helper components from other areas. And so that ability to kind of see like, where are those things coming from, which is really great. So I just wanted to share that as well. Awesome. So I think I'll pause there and just kind of, I want to walk through maybe some more of the basics of Figma, just to really talk a bit more about some of the features that are most helpful. So one thing that I use all the time is when I'm using Figma, I love to use what's called version history in here. And this is not a feature that's very well known, but just wanted to call this out. When you click on the chevron here and you choose to show version history, on the right-hand side, you'll see all of your different versions. And what I love about this feature specifically is, let's say you wanted to point someone to feedback from maybe earlier this morning. Well, you can right click on that version and you can choose to copy a link to that version and send it to them. And so now a viewer of that link will be able to see your library and where you were at, or your design and where you were at that time, without having to duplicate the entire file. So I just wanted to share that workflow as well. And there's also a little bit more, like if we want to go into Figma and think a bit more about how to build a component like this, where perhaps you select on it, maybe you're using this component in your design here, and you might see something that looks a bit like this in the sidebar, which has all of these different options. Now, what's really cool about this is we have this piece of UI, right? And as a designer who is using this component, I can turn this control off or on. I can hide or show the image. I could hide or show those buttons down there. And I can even hide or show the title and change what the title says. So we could say hello, and we change the title in the component. Now, this is really cool because this just makes working with the actual component itself much easier for anyone who's actually consuming or using the design system. And so really briefly, I just wanted to share how to do something like that if this is something you're interested in. So over here, I've got an actual main component. And then over here, I have an instance of that component. And if I click on the instance, you'll see, unlike before, I don't have any of those controls over here that are available. And so to set this up, it's really easy. We just need to click on the main component, select the item that we want to either show or hide with those controls. And then on the right-hand side, if we look at the layer panel, we'll see this little icon here. This gives you the ability to create a Boolean property, what's called. And we can select this and we can actually give that property a name. So in this case, we want to show the title, right? Or we'll just call this title. And we can create that property. And now if we click on our instance, you'll see that we have a title property there and we can hide or show it. And that's really powerful because this allows us to create dynamic components. And if we wanted to edit this title a little bit easier as well, we could also select the title again. And if we go down here to content, you'll see that we have a new property, and we could add this and we could call this title text, let's say, and we can create that property. And now when I click on the instance, I have the ability to turn off or on that title. And I can also change the text. I can say connect AirPods, and we can, a little misspelling there, but now we can correct that and we can see that right on the canvas. And the same exists everywhere within Figma and for all of the things that you're thinking about. The reason that this is so powerful, and I really, I love teaching about it, is because before we would have to create several different variants of components, maybe dozens or even hundreds in some cases, to support all of these different properties that we might want to include, right? Like we might want to include hiding or showing the title, the description, the close button, the image, the button. And so being able to do this just with one instance of a main component is so helpful, and just wanted to share this. I know we've got about 20 minutes left, and so I actually want to pause here and just make room for any questions that come up, just around working in Figma, working as a designer, getting jobs, portfolios, or any career-related or industry-related questions that I can help answer. I would love to. Got chat open. Feel free to unmute or even type in chat. I would love to help if I can.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joey. Hi, everyone. Please, if you have any question, you can leave it in the chat or just raise your hand and I will let you in to ask your question. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for your help. In short, there's a lot of things in Figma, a lot of things that hopefully can help you that we just talked about, especially as you're creating these. And the thing that I want to call out to you just before any questions is you don't need to be a design systems designer to take advantage of many of these features. I think by using them, they've taught me that they just help you become a bit faster as a designer. Some things might work if you're creating components for a team, but if you're creating things just for yourself, many of these features might be helpful. And so I just wanted to kind of pass that knowledge on. Awesome. I see Kelvin's up. Kelvin,
Hi,
do you want to
Kelvin.
unmute and do you have a question?
Yeah. Kelvin, please, you can unmute.
Hi.
Hey, Kelvin, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Cool. I gotcha. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask because I'm more interested on learning about auto layout and constraints. So do you have any tutorials that someone can go and go over about more about Figma and other
Yeah.
things like?
You bet. Let me share a link. I'll put this in our chat. So I write a newsletter, and in here I try to include all sorts of tips around auto layout and just working with things. I know you mentioned constraints. That's a big one that's mentioned, and there's like hours and hours of content on this that we could talk about. I actually do a bit of videos on YouTube, and so you might want to check those out as well. But honestly, to start with, I would just Google and search within Figma's documentation around constraints and auto layout, because they have some really great examples of maybe some setups that you might find applicable to the work that you're doing and how to work with both of those at the same time.
Okay, then last one.
Sure.
Where can someone send you maybe their portfolio for you to review them and advise them on where they should
Sure.
do, maybe correct and maybe do more?
Yeah, feel free. I'm on ADPL, and feel free to book some time together if you'd want to do a portfolio review. I'm trying to scale my time the best I can. So you know, if you do find me on Twitter or such, just note that I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. But I think the easiest way is probably through ADPL. That way we've got time in the calendar, and it's there and it's booked and it's yours.
Okay, so we just use the name The Joy.
Yep, exactly. I can grab a link for you real quick. That way we've got
I'll
it.
appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for asking about that. I'll put that in chat as well.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. I saw a question in the Q&A chat around how do I handle
Yeah.
design system documentation? That's a good one. I personally, you know, Figma is a great tool, but I don't know if it's always a like a documentation tool, right? Because just before 2 weeks ago, there wasn't spell check and it was a bit hard to use. But as you think about working in Figma, you want to think about providing the space for documentation and for people to understand how you're building your design system where everyone can understand and everyone can view it, right? And the reason I say that is it's not always possible for a PM or an engineer or anyone else at the company or the team that you're working on to have access to Figma. And so if you're thinking about putting all of your documentation inside of this tool, it might be restrictive in that way. So for me, I've actually just been starting to write a lot of documentation directly in Google Docs and then taking that link and actually just pasting it on the component itself. And for a quick example of this, let me share something and how this looks. So if I, for example, if I take a link, so we'll just pretend here. So if I want to include documentation around this component here, one thing you can do is you can click this little this little settings icon, and inside you'll actually see a spot for a link. And so here I can paste directly, in this case, a link to Apple's documentation. And how this works is if I click on an instance and I go to the inspect panel, just kind of imagining here that I'm an engineer and I'm looking for inspecting this component. If I were to click this view documentation button, this will take me directly to that link that I pasted in previously. And so this makes an easy way just to have a one-to-one with maybe that Google Doc that you're writing, or maybe Notion, or maybe an internal site if you're there with your team, just to connect the two a bit more. So I hope that helps. Awesome. Okay, scrolling through the chat. Let's see. So the next one is, what's the best way to structure your design file, and what does an effective handoff process look like? That's a great question. How I structure my own files, and I'll just keep sharing my screen just to make it easy here, is I will basically build all of the components within different frames on the canvas. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I'll think a lot about this from the slides earlier. I'll think a lot about this file system and how I want to structure things, right? The reason that the design tokens kind of sits at the very top of this is I want every file to be able to access colors and sizes and typography and effects and things like that. So I want every file to be able to have access to this. And what I mean when I say access to this is Figma has an awesome feature where you can actually go into your settings panel here inside of a team, and you can enable libraries for that specific team, right? So if you have an iOS team or an Android team, you can go in and you can turn on those libraries so that any new file inside the Android team will, for example, pull all Android components. And so I think that part there is really, really great and effective. And so that's kind of how I think about that. I hope that helps. And if you're looking to learn more about exactly how I structure things, I would recommend, again, just grabbing that iOS 16 kit. In here, it'll show exactly how I label things, how I think about variants, how I think about the organization of these different components, and even how I think about names here. On the note of engineering handoff, one thing I'd love to do is just trying to make sure that these properties map exactly to what is seen for a component, right? If in the component, trying to map these directly to what that word is, right? Maybe it's not icon, but maybe it's has icon, right? And so working with your engineer partner to make this relevant. That way, when they go in and they inspect it, all of those properties here for, let's say, that individual instance are mapping to what is in code. So great question on that. Awesome. I saw another question around, I'm just starting out in UI and UX, and so far I've been learning as much as I can on the topic, but the learning has been scattered. And is there a course or pathway to make learning more organized and productive? That's a great question. I don't know that I'm able to recommend one right now, but there are several out there, specifically around Figma. I think what I would suggest here is just trying to understand a bit more about what you're interested in. If you want to learn more on the prototyping side, right? There's all sorts of courses and even free YouTube videos around like how to prototype better in Figma. If you're wanting to learn more about like, what does it mean to create a consistent, good user experience? I would recommend starting by practicing. And what I mean by this is, let's say you want to redesign an app to get practice, right? I wouldn't recommend redesigning, let's say, all of Spotify. I would recommend looking at a certain screen, let's say like your profile settings screen in Spotify, and thinking about how could that be better? What parts of that could you improve? Do the controls make sense? Does the text make sense? That sort of thing, I think, will really teach you a lot about looking at something that a company has created and just understanding that screen and then taking it a step further in the direction that you believe is right. So I hope that helps. Awesome. Let's see, taking a look. There's a question here around what does a career as a design systems product designer look like? That's a great question because that's exactly where I'm at right now. It's my favorite role in the world because as a design systems product designer, you get to work with all designers in the company and you get to understand where the product is heading because you have to keep up with the product, right? And so my personal days are structured around meeting with different teams, seeing different features that are maybe being revised or up and coming, and really working to make sure that we've got the right components to support those teams and those individuals and perhaps where the feature or the product is going. And so a lot of it is just meeting and talking and making sure that we're building the right things in Figma. My favorite part of the role is just getting to work in Figma and being able to build for a few hours at a time of, all right, we need this component, it needs to do X, Y, and Z, let's make that happen in Figma and then hand that off to engineers. Also, a big part of it is just getting feedback, right? Like understanding from the team how your design system is working, how your components are working. And so that might be in the form of office hours, that might be in the form of just meeting with people regularly or checking in with the team. And so that communication part is a big part of the role and most of what I do, I feel like some days. I hope that helps. That's a great question. Let's see. What's the difference between a design system and a style guide? That's from Joe. That's a great question. I feel like I'm still learning this all the time. I think a style guide or a component library is something that is really just relevant to those who are using the components, whereas a design system is the combination of your Figma library, your color token set, your documentation, your engineering handoff processes, your everything that's related to designing and developing for the product with the design system, I think is the design system. And so in Figma, I don't think we're ever really creating design systems. I think we're creating component libraries that work with the design system. And that's the framing I've personally been trying to use. So there's a lot there. I think really just if there's like 3 or 4 things, it's the component library in Figma, proper documentation, proper handoff practices, and really just like adoption of the library, right? And of components. And I think all of those make an effective design system. Awesome. Someone asked, what is the right naming patterns for layers when designing? My short answer is it's unique. It really depends on you and how you want to approach it. If you're looking for exactly how I do it, again, I think that iOS Kit would be a great resource for me, I like to just immediately put in there, what is the component called? I'll use, I think it's a Pascal case where both letters of the words are capitalized. And so I'll put that in there just so it matches, let's say, what's in React and what is actually in the code component. So yeah, take a look. Maybe you find some things that work for you, maybe others not so much. And I would just try to borrow from that. Awesome. I see someone is up with a hand raised. I would love to hear what you've got.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jay. So I would like to know, component properties takes away the need to create multiple variants. So I would still like to know what are specific scenarios where you still have to default back to variants.
Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, okay, so what I'm saying, well, I'm trying to, if you could talk a little bit more about when you use variants and when you use component properties. Okay,
that makes sense. In short, because I know we have a few minutes left, where I like to use a variance is if you are seeing, let's say you have a button, right? And for that button, you have a primary color, maybe a danger color, a warning color, and then a disabled color, right? It wouldn't be great to have 4 separate button components that are then in the assets panel for a designer to find, because you might also have a size property, right? Like maybe those sizes of buttons are different, and that asset panel doesn't do a great job of identifying really quickly what that component looks like and its size. And so when you think about a button, it's just a button, right? It's a thing that can take on different styles. And so whenever you're kind of in that situation, you're like, this is the thing. It could look different, but it's still the thing. I think that is an approach, or that's an opportunity to use variants, because you're just modifying what the thing is. You're giving it different stylistic properties, or maybe selection states, or different scenarios like that. So that's my biggest piece of advice. I think you'll kind of know as you go. You know, if you're working with 2 totally separate components, but they're doing the same thing, they might look similar. That might be a good opportunity to think about. Is a designer going to be using each of these kind of in the same time, right? And if so, maybe I can combine those as variants. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for coming up and asking. I really appreciate it. Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this session. My question is basically around design tokens and how, like, you collaborate with engineers to like determine, what naming convention you want to use for the components. Is there like a special, like, skill or like a special way of like, doing it? And if there's any tips I can share on that. Thank you.
Great question. So just to repeat, it sounds like the question is around like, what does the process look like? And is that a special skill of like designing tokens, sets, and working with engineers? Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. That's a great question. So one, I think the fact that you're even asking that is amazing, because tokens are such a big part of design systems and really how we want to think about consistency and scalability, at least within design and Figma, right? And so for me, I try to think about like, how is a designer going to be using this particular text layer or this text style or this color style? And how can I map that a little bit more, right? So maybe you find that you have purpose-driven tokens where you might say like border danger or border success, right? Or background success. Or maybe your design system is pretty small and you want to just say, no, we actually just support green and light mode and green and dark mode. And it's up to the designer or myself to interpret like when and how to use that. And so I think once you define on the best way of naming that sort of thing based on purpose-driven or kind of stylistic-driven, then you can work with an engineer to say, all right, here's how I'm thinking about naming. What is the best way to kind of translate this and to make sure that this name is supported by code and that I'm thinking about naming this in the right, like with the right nomenclature, right? Of this is how the capitalization should be. This is where we have a dash, those sorts of things. There's a lot more on tokens that I'm still even learning about. This is a big world. And so I really recommend people like Gina Ann, who have just wonderful talks and all sorts of resources online. They're amazing and know so much about this space. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight, but there's a ton there.
Thank you so much. I think that
You're
really
so
helps.
welcome.
One last question. I just
Sure.
wanted to ask if there's any tool that you use for like documentation. I think you mentioned it earlier. I must have missed that.
Great question. For most teams I've been a part of, we've done it internally, so we build our own thing. But I would recommend tools like, I know Zero Height is a tool that a lot of people use. Even using free tools such as Google Docs or Notion, and then just doing a good job of linking out. I know a lot of people are using Notion these days to kind of build like the back end CMS part of the design system documentation, and then creating a front end experience using that. And so if you're small and you're maybe limited on resources, I would try to take advantage of what is already out there that I can use just to get words out and to get some of these guidelines, to those who are relying on the design system.
Thank you. Awesome.
Of course. Thanks for coming up and for unmuting. Good to meet you and appreciate the question. I think we're at time, so I'll probably pause there. But I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me. I'm always available. I'm on Twitter. I'm on ADPL, as mentioned before. Feel free to reach out, say hello if you ever have any questions about this, or if there's anything I went too fast on or that you'd like a little bit more clarity, just let me know and I'd love to say hi.
We have one person hand up, so.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Please, you can go ahead and ask your question now.
Hey, can you hear us okay? Oh, I see. Connecting to audio. Oh no, I'm having a little trouble.
Yes, there's a pretty trouble like connecting. I'm so sorry.
All good.
Yeah, just wanted to like say thank you for the lesson. It's quite expensive.
Thank you.
Like one or two, because I'm going into Cadana. I was not there when you were explaining the cooking, so I guess I'll just chat you up on Twitter. Then maybe I will just get some explanation.
I'm sorry. I think I may have lost you a little bit. I heard you were very new to Figma, but I didn't catch after that.
Yeah, what I said is I entered like the lesson late. Like I joined late, so I did not like really catch up with most things you were saying. And that's because like I was not really like in a comfortable place. But I will chat you up on Twitter, then we'll talk better, sir.
Cool.
Okay.
Well, thanks for unmuting and saying that. I really appreciate it, and I think this is recorded and will be handed out, and so hopefully you'll be able to catch up there.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, please. Sounds good. Great.
Awesome. Okay, I've gone ahead to mute her. Okay, Joey, we want to say thank you so much for, your time. I can see one person hand is also up. So I think we'll just take the last question, then we'll wrap up. Hey,
Sounds
two
good.
people, okay. All right, awesome.
Hi, good evening. Good evening from me. Can you hear me?
Oh no. Do you mind? I may have missed what you said there.
Hello.
I can hear you now.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
Good. Thanks. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, I joined the class late because I got the mail late. So I guess
good.
I already missed a whole lot. But I want to ask a question. That's about handover. When you have to hand over your designs to developers, to DevOps, how do you hand over and how do you document?
So great question. Without going too in depth here, what I would say is I would try to personally, and most companies I've used, we use Slack. And so I like creating a Slack channel based on every component that we're designing for. That way there's a stream of like questions, there's a stream of history there. And that will be involved with myself and any engineers or product people that I'm working with. And that way that history is there. In Figma, I like to create a separate handoff file. And so in there, you might have the component that's there. You might be pointing to different, items or states of the component, especially if you're using variants and really kind of calling out what those properties are. And beyond that, just, constant communication, right? Never tossing something over the fence for someone else to figure out, but really kind of walking through together of like, okay, this is what that should look like. Here's what that should feel like. Let's see if we have the interaction details right. I think can be super helpful. So, we also talked a little bit about this maybe before you joined. So hopefully if you catch the recording, you'll be able to pick up some of that content too.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for saying hey. Awesome. Well, I do have to take off, but I want to say thank you so much, everyone, for attending, for saying hello.
Yeah.
It's awesome to get to know all of you and to have the chance to share. So I really, really appreciate it. I'm glad that I got to say hi.
Thank you very much, Joey, for also making time. And let me just use this opportunity to pass on that, guys. Everyone will get access to the recording of this session. We'll share a link with everyone via email. You can also feel free to reach out to Joey on any of his social media platforms, so Twitter, LinkedIn, I know for sure of those two, then ADP list too as well. Any resources that Joey have shared on this particular meeting will be attached to the email that we are going to forward to you. Let me use this time again to say, Joey, thank you so much for making time to join us this evening, and we really appreciate your efforts to teach us with all the insights that you have in your experience. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That means a lot. I was so glad to be here. And yeah, I know we went really in depth on some things, but hopefully, very in depth to get you to, to get anyone to be able to explore these things a bit further. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And awesome. Just before we end, guys, I want to say that I'm excited to announce that everyone who is on this call have the opportunity to join our Slack channel created for remote workers and freelancers, to be precise. So basically, it is called Cadana Connect. I'm going to share the link in our chat so that you can RSVP or register to join. So from the Cadana Connect channel, you get to meet other remote workers, you get to connect with them. We share resources with you. You engage in conversations about tech ecosystem, personal finances, remote work, and everything in between. So kindly feel free to register for that through the link that we've shared in your chat. And last but not the least, I also want to mention that everyone who have joined this call actually stand a chance to win $5 into their Cadana USD account. So all you need to do is to go to Play Store or App Store. If you are a freelancer or a remote worker, go to Play Store or App Store, download the app, register, complete your KYC. And once you make your first initial deposit, you get a bonus of $5. So use Cadana to open a USD bank account, euros and pounds bank account for free to manage your borderless compensation. Receive international payments with the best exchange rates, exchange currencies in real time, and pay all your international transactions with Cadana virtual card. Thank you all once again for making time for today. And we look forward to make this happen in next year. So stay tuned and good night. Joey,
bye everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again. All right, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.